Start with Dr. Tucker. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. As you have heard, we are going to try to cover a fair amount today. I'm going to start by telling a little bit about the history of our division, and then we'll each talk about one particular area of research, and mine will be this work that Marcia mentioned that Dr. Stevenson began with young children who report memories of past lives. As she said, we do not have anything to disclose as far as conflicts of interest. So, the story begins with Ian Stevenson, and he came here to be the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry in 1957. At that point, he was in the middle of quite a successful mainstream career. He had nearly 70 publications to his credit at that point. But he also had an interest in parapsychology. And after he had been here a while, he heard about these cases of children from various parts of the world who described memories of a past life. And he decided to go investigate those cases. He was able to fund that travel with the help of Chester Carlson, which is a name you've already heard with people holding the Chester Carlson chair. Chester Carlson invented the Xerox machine, so he was quite wealthy, and he became a big supporter of Ian's. So in 1967, with Carlson's help, Ian was able to step down as chairman of the department and establish what we now call the Division of Perceptual Studies. So that this year marks our 50th year anniversary, and we've been going strong ever since then. And most of the time, our home was this old clapboard house on Wortland Street, which is now student housing. A few years ago, we moved to our current home, which is near the downtown mall, and we certainly don't occupy the entire building. But we do have the Ian Stevenson Memorial Library there, which has over 5,000 books in it. And we also have a neuroimaging lab. And as for Ian, once he established the division in 1967, he spent the bulk of the next 40 years focused on these cases of children reporting past life memories. He published numerous books and papers about them. One of his books was reviewed in JAMA, and it was actually reviewed by the book review editor, who wrote, "In regard to reincarnation, he has painstakingly and unemotionally collected a detailed series of cases from India, cases in which the evidence is difficult to explain on any other grounds. He has placed on record a large amount of data that cannot be ignored." So to tell you a little bit about this phenomenon, we have now studied over 2,500 cases from around the world. They are easiest to find in cultures with a belief in reincarnation, but they have been found wherever anyone has looked for them. They have been found on all the continents except Antarctica, and they typically involve very young children who spontaneously start talking about a past life and a recent ordinary past life. These kids are not claiming to be Cleopatra or Julius Caesar or anything like that, just describing somebody who lived and died. The one part of the life that's often out of the ordinary is how the previous person died. In over 70% of the cases, the previous person died by unnatural means, meaning murder, suicide, accident, combat, that sort of thing. And often the kids, in fact, in most of the cases that we've investigated, the kids give enough details so that people have been able to confirm that somebody did actually live and die whose life matches the details that the child gave. Now, along with the statements, the children often show emotional or behavioral features that seem connected to the material they're describing, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. In addition, some children even have birthmarks or birth defects that matched wounds, usually the fatal wounds, on the body of the previous person. And Ian studied a lot of these cases. One was a little girl who remembered the life of a man who got his fingers chopped off as he was being murdered, and the little girl was born with her hands looking like that. There was a boy who remembered the life of a boy in another village who had lost the fingers of his right hand in a fodder chopping machine, and the second little boy was born with his hands looking like that, which is quite an unusual defect. And then there was a boy who remembered the life of a man who had been killed by a shotgun blast to the side of his head, and the little boy was born with just a stump for an ear and an underdeveloped right side of his face. Ian also listed 18 cases in which children were born with two birthmarks, ones that matched both the entrance wound and the exit wound on the body of a gunshot victim. Now, in recent years, we have focused more on American cases, and we can now say with certainty that this is not purely a cultural phenomenon that takes place in areas with a belief in reincarnation, because we have lots of American cases, and most of them take place in families who had never believed in reincarnation before the children started talking about a past life. So I want to give you an example of a case, and then I'll turn things over to Bruce. This is a case that got some publicity a few years ago. It's a little boy named James Leininger. Oh, he's not so little anymore, but James was the son of a Christian couple in Louisiana, and his dad in particular was quite opposed to the idea of reincarnation before all of this started. But around the time of his second birthday, James started having horrible nightmares multiple times a week in which he would be kicking his legs up in the air and screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And during the day, he would take his little toy airplanes and he would say, "Airplane crash on fire," and bam, he would slam them into the family's coffee table. He did this over and over again, and his parents are apparently tolerant people, because their coffee table had dozens of scratches and dents from "airplane crash on fire," bam. So when you add that play to the nightmares that he was having, he really looked like a traumatized child, but he had not experienced any trauma, at least in this life. And then a little while after his second birthday, his parents were able to have several conversations with him during the day in which he could talk about these things. And he said how his plane had crashed on fire, how he had been shot down by the Japanese, and he said that he flew a Corsair. Now, I'd never heard of a Corsair, but it was a special plane that was developed during World War II. Then when he was 28 months old, he said one day that his plane had flown off of a boat, and his parents asked him the name of the boat, and he said Natoma. And it turns out that there was a USS Natoma Bay that was stationed in the Pacific during World War II.
James Leininger is all boy, 6 years old and full of spirit.
This is a special plane that goes in reverse. You don't see a lot of that.
James knows a lot about planes, especially war planes.
What kind of airplane is that?
A Corsair.
His parents, Andrea and Bruce Leininger, say from an early age James would play with nothing else.
He was obsessed with airplanes. You look around the house, that's all you'll see. Airplanes, helicopters, aircraft carriers.
But then, when he was 2, the planes James loved suddenly began to give him frequent and frightening nightmares.
I'd wake him up and he'd be screaming, and he'd always be laying on his back, kicking his feet up at the ceiling. And I'd say, "Baby, what were you dreaming about?" And he'd say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out."
They sound like typical kiddie nightmares, but Andrea says they went on the same way for months. Maybe too much TV. But James was just 2, and his parents say only watching Barney and Teletubbies.
Teletubbies!
And Andrea and Bruce say they weren't watching World War II documentaries or conversing about military history.
This is an F-18?
No, that one.
So what explains the nightmares and James's strange obsession with airplanes?
Then when he was 2.5, his father bought this book on Iwo Jima to give to his own father, James's grandfather, for Christmas. And he was looking through it one day when James came and got in his lap. And they were thumbing through it, and they got to this page, and James pointed at the picture and said, "That's where my plane was shot down." And his dad said, "What?" And he said, "My airplane got shot down there, Daddy." And that just floored his dad that his 2.5-year-old was talking like that. And then he learned that, in fact, the Natoma Bay did take part in the Iwo Jima operation. Then when James got old enough to draw, he drew dozens and dozens of pictures of planes and battle scenes, and he always signed them James III and said that he was the third James. Well, eventually with all this going on, his dad did begin to wonder if he was remembering a past life. So when James was 4.5, he went to a Natoma Bay reunion. And he learned that one and only one pilot from the ship had been killed during the Iwo Jima operation. This was a young man from Pennsylvania named James Houston. So what we can do is compare what James Leininger said to James Houston's life to see how well they match. Now, James's parents said that he also talked about family life before the war, but we don't have documentation of those statements that was made before Houston was identified. But what we do have here, this is a list of items where we do have definite documentation made before anyone knew anything about James Houston. So James signed his drawings James III. Houston was James Jr., which would make James Leininger the third James. James said he flew off the Natoma. Houston was the pilot on the USS Natoma Bay. James said he flew a Corsair. Houston had flown a Corsair. He was actually flying a different plane when he was killed, but he was part of the squadron that tested the Corsair for the Navy. James said he was shot down by the Japanese, and Houston was shot down by the Japanese. James said he died at Iwo Jima. Houston was the one and only Natoma Bay pilot killed during the Iwo Jima operation. James said one day, quote, "My airplane got shot in the engine and crashed in the water, and that's how I died." Eyewitnesses reported that Houston's plane was, quote, "hit head-on right on the middle of the engine." James had nightmares of his plane crashing and sinking in the water, and Houston's plane crashed in the water and quickly sank. And James said one day that his friend Jack Larson was there, and Jack Larson was the pilot of the plane next to Houston's on the day that he was killed. James is now 18 years old. He graduated from high school last spring, and he has now joined the Navy. So with that, I will turn things over to Bruce Grayson.